The coffee cup trembled in Lyra's hands as she stared across the small table, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew who I was the entire time, didn't you? Atlas Rivera, the man who had held her so tenderly just hours before, who had whispered her name like a prayer against her skin, couldn't meet her eyes. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with the weight of 15 years of secrets. Answer me," she demanded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "When you touched me, when you made love to me, when you told me you were falling for me, you knew exactly who I was." Welcome back, Golden Family. If you're new here, you've just discovered your new obsession. Stories that sparkle with romance, drama, and twists you'll never see coming. And if you're back again, well, you know exactly why you're here. Let's get back to the story. 15 years earlier, the Rivera Tech building hadn't existed. Atlas Rivera had been Atlas Sterling in everything but name, living in the sprawling Palo Alto mansion that Richard Sterling had built with his tech empire. At 20, Atlas had been the lost kid Richard rescued from aging out of foster care. He was a golden boy, brilliant, ambitious, and completely devoted to the family that had given him everything. Now, at 42, Atlas stood in his corner office on the 40th floor, holding the only photograph he'd kept from his old life. Richard Sterling arm around Atlas like a proud father. And there, caught between them with a gap-toothed grin and wild curls, 15-year-old Lyra Sterling in her favorite dinosaur t-shirt. His little shadow. The girl who used to sneak into his room at midnight, begging him to explain coding concepts that most adults couldn't grasp. Who would curl up in his lap while he worked, falling asleep to the rhythm of his typing. Who looked at him like he hung the moon and stars. Atlas traced Lyra's face in the photograph with his thumb, remembering how she'd fought with Richard the night before Atlas was expelled. She'd discovered the truth about the stolen algorithm, about her father's lies. "You can't make him go," 15-year-old Lyra had screamed at her father. "He's family. He's the only one who actually listens to me, who believes in me." "Lyra, you don't understand the situation," Richard had said, his voice dangerously calm. "Atlas betrayed our trust. He's not the person you think he is. You're lying." Lyra had sobbed. "Atlas would never steal anything. You're the liar." The fight had escalated until Lyra had locked herself in her room, refusing to come out until Richard fixed this. She'd written Atlas letter after letter, slipping them under his door, begging him to take her with him when he left. Atlas had wanted to. God, how he'd wanted to protect her from the truth about her father. But couldn't kidnap a 15-year-old, even to save her from Richard's manipulation? He'd left before dawn, Lyra's final letter clutched in his hand. "I'll find you someday, Atlas. I promise. I'll never forget you." But she had forgotten him. Completely. Atlas had hired a private investigator few years after leaving, desperate to know if Lyra was okay. The report had been devastating. Lyra Sterling recovering from severe depression and memory issues following a traumatic period in her teens. She was seeing a therapist 3 times a week and had no recollection of the events that had triggered her breakdown. Richard had been quoted in the report, speaking to Lyra's doctor. She became obsessed with a former employee who had to be dismissed for theft. The attachment was unhealthy, almost like Stockholm Syndrome. The memory loss is probably a blessing. She can move forward without that trauma. Atlas had crumpled the report in his fists, understanding exactly what Richard had done. Unable to control Lyra's loyalty to Atlas, Richard had systematically convinced her that her own memories were lies, that her love for Atlas was unhealthy obsession, that forgetting him was healing. It was psychological manipulation of the cruelest kind, and it had worked perfectly. The algorithm that had made Richard Sterling a billionaire, the foundation of Sterling Corp's entire AI division, had been born in Atlas's mind during those late nights when Lyra would fall asleep against his chest. He'd been so proud when he'd finally cracked the code, so excited to show Richard what he'd accomplished. "This could revolutionize everything," Atlas had said, spreading the printouts across Richard's mahogany desk. "Predictive analytics that actually learn and adapt. I was thinking we could file the patent jointly, maybe spin it off into its own division." Richard's smile had been warm, paternal. "Atlas, you brilliant boy. Of course we'll make sure you get full credit for this." 3 weeks later, Atlas had been arrested for corporate espionage. The charges had been dropped eventually, hard to prove theft when the stolen code existed only in Atlas's head and personal notebooks. But by then Richard had already filed the patent under Sterling Corp's name, claiming Atlas had developed it using company resources and time. "You're like a son to me," Richard had said during their final confrontation, his voice heavy with manufactured disappointment. "But I can't have someone I can't trust living in my home around my daughter. Lyra looks up to you, Atlas. What kind of example would I be setting if I let this slide? Atlas set the photograph back in his desk drawer and turned to face the wall of windows overlooking Silicon Valley. 15 years of building Rivera Tech from nothing, of proving he wasn't the unstable kid Richard had painted him as. 15 years of watching Lyra's name appear in business magazines as Sterling Corp's rising star, knowing she had no memory of the brother who'd once promised never to leave her. He'd never planned a hostile takeover. 4 years, his only goal had been to become successful enough that maybe someday he could reach out to Lyra again. Successful enough that when she learned the truth, she'd have the strength and independence to handle it. But Richard had forced his hand. It started 6 months ago, when Atlas's success finally became impossible to ignore. Rivera Tech had landed 3 major contracts that put them in direct competition with Sterling Corp for the first time. Instead of competing fairly, Richard had launched a systematic campaign of destruction. Whispers at industry events, Atlas Rivera was obsessed with the Sterling family, unstable, trying to steal clients through underhanded tactics. Then came the poaching of Rivera Tech's biggest accounts, always preceded by mysterious meetings between Richard and Atlas's clients. The final straw had come 3 weeks ago, when Atlas discovered that Richard had been spreading rumors about Rivera Tech's financial stability, causing 2 major investors to pull out at the last minute. 43 employees, brilliant engineers and developers who believed in Atlas's vision, were facing layoffs because of Richard's lies. Richard wasn't just protecting his business. He was ensuring that Atlas could never become powerful enough to threaten his control over Lyra's narrative. That's when Atlas had made the decision to fight back. The hostile takeover wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about protecting the people who depended on him, and about finally having enough power to tell Lyra the truth without Richard being able to destroy him for it. But tonight's Tech Innovation Summit wasn't about business for Atlas. It was about seeing Lyra again even from across a crowded room. Just to know she was okay, that she was happy, that some part of the brilliant girl he'd loved was still alive beneath Richard's careful conditioning. He'd never imagined he'd actually talk to her. He'd certainly never imagined she'd look at him like a stranger and offer to rescue him from the very world her father had built. Sometimes, Atlas thought as he straightened his tie, the universe had a twisted sense of humor. The Grand Meridian's ballroom glittered like a constellation of ambition and champagne. Tech moguls, venture capitalists, and startup founders mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their conversations a symphony of disruption and market domination. Atlas Rivera stood near the entrance, adjusting his black tie and scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read rooms for survival. He spotted Richard Sterling immediately, silver-haired and commanding in his custom tuxedo, holding court near the main stage like the tech royalty he'd become. At 50, Richard looked every inch the visionary leader, his smile warm and paternal as he greeted admirers and potential partners. Atlas's jaw tightened. 15 years, and Richard still had that same ability to make everyone in the room feel like they were in the presence of greatness. No one here knew about the stolen algorithms, the destroyed lives, the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his empire. Atlas Rivera? A voice behind him made him turn. James Patterson from TechCrunch, recorder already in hand. Didn't expect to see you here. Any truth to the rumors about Rivera Tech making some major moves? Just here to support innovation, Atlas replied smoothly, his attention already drifting across the room. He wasn't here for networking or business deals. He was here for one reason only, to catch a glimpse of the girl who'd once been his whole world, just to know she was okay. "Excuse me," Atlas murmured to the reporter, moving deeper into the crowd. The ballroom was a maze of designer gowns and expensive suits, but Atlas found himself drawn toward the bar area by some instinct he couldn't name. His chest felt tight with anticipation and dread. What if she wasn't here? What if she was, but seeing her only made the loss feel fresh again? That's when he saw her. A woman in a black cocktail dress stood at the marble bar, her back to him as she spoke to the bartender. Even from behind, Atlas knew. The elegant line of her shoulders, the way she tilted her head slightly when thinking, the unconscious grace that had been there even when she was 15, it was unmistakably Lyra. His breath caught in his throat as she turned in profile. The wild curls had been tamed into a sleek bob, the gap between her teeth had been fixed, but those eyes were exactly the same. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with pride and loss. His little shadow had grown into a stunning woman. But when she glanced around the room, her gaze passed right over him without the slightest flicker of recognition. Richard's conditioning had been thorough. "Another champagne?" the bartender asked her. "Actually, something stronger. Whiskey neat." Atlas smiled despite the pain in his chest. His Lyra had always been tougher than she looked. He moved toward the bar, his heart hammering against his ribs. 15 years of wondering, of hoping, of building himself into someone worthy of her family again, and now she was right there, close enough to touch. Another whiskey, neat, he heard himself say, settling onto the adjacent bar stool. Lyra glanced sideways at him, and when their eyes met, Atlas felt like he'd been struck by lightning. She was looking at him with polite curiosity, the way she might look at any attractive stranger, but he could see everything he remembered in her face. The intelligence, the kindness, the stubborn streak that had made her fight for him all those years ago. She had no idea who he was. "Rough night?" she asked, and hearing her voice again, that same musical quality he remembered from bedtime stories and late-night coding sessions, nearly broke his composure. Atlas stared at her, drinking in every detail. The way she unconsciously bit her lower lip when she was thinking. The small scar on her thumb from when she tried to help him fix a computer at age 10. The way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, just like they had when she was little. She was his Lyra, all grown up, and she was talking to him like he was a complete stranger. "Is it that obvious?" he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You have the look of someone who'd rather be anywhere else." She gestured at the crowd with her whiskey, and Atlas caught a glimpse of the rebellious spirit he remembered. Join the club. She was still the same person underneath, still the girl who'd sneak out of formal dinners to build blanket forts, who'd rather spend time with books and computers than at society parties. The realization made his throat tight with emotion. "Atlas," he said, extending his hand. When she took it, her fingers were exactly as he remembered, long and elegant, with that small scar she probably didn't even remember getting. The simple contact sent electricity racing through him, not just attraction but recognition, homecoming, the feeling of touching family. "Lyra," she replied, and hearing her say her own name to him like they were strangers nearly shattered his heart. But then she smiled, that same mischievous grin he remembered from 1,000 childhood moments, and added, "I know just the place. Dive bar with questionable hygiene but amazing food. Want to escape?" The invitation hit him so hard. She was asking him to leave with her. Lyra, his Lyra, was offering to rescue him from her father's world, just like she used to rescue injured birds and stray cats when she was little. She was still trying to save things, even when she didn't remember why it mattered. "Are you seriously asking me to ditch this glamorous evening, Lyra?" he asked, testing her name on his tongue like a prayer he'd been forbidden to say for 15 years. "Maybe I am." Her smile was pure mischief, and for a moment she looked exactly like the 15-year-old who used to dare him to sneak ice cream at midnight. They abandoned their drinks and slipped out together, Lyra leading him through a side exit with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. The cool night air was a relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom, and Atlas found himself studying her profile in the streetlight, cataloging every change and every similarity to the girl he'd lost. "So what do you do when you're not rescuing strangers from corporate hell?" Lyra asked as they walked, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. "I run a small software company. Nothing too exciting." The lie tasted bitter, but how could he tell her the truth? That he'd built Rivera Tech as a monument to everything Richard had stolen from him? That every line of code he'd written had been an attempt to prove himself worthy of the family that had discarded him? "What about you?" he asked, though he already knew. He'd read every article about her, watched every interview, followed her career from a distance like a ghost haunting his own past. Acquisitions and strategy for a family business. It sounds more glamorous than it is. She wrinkled her nose in exactly the same way she used to when Richard made her attend board meetings as a child. "Most days I feel like I'm playing corporate dress-up." Atlas's heart swelled with pride and pain. She was still the same person, still brilliant, still creative, still feeling trapped by expectations that didn't fit who she really was. "What would you rather be doing?" he asked gently, though he suspected he knew the answer. Lyra had always been a storyteller, always curious about the world beyond her father's empire. The question seemed to catch her off guard, and Atlas realized with a pang that no one had asked her that in years. Maybe ever. Wow. No one's asked me that in years. She paused, considering, and Atlas held his breath. Travel journalism, maybe? Or documentary filmmaking. Something where I could tell real stories instead of just moving money around. Pride flooded through him. The same pride he'd felt when she'd won her first chess tournament at 12, when she'd gotten into Stanford, when she'd landed her first job. She still had dreams. Despite everything Richard had done to mold her into the perfect corporate heir, some part of the curious, passionate girl Atlas remembered was still alive. "What's stopping you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer to that too. Family expectations. Guilt. The usual. She laughed, but it sounded hollow. God, I sound like such a cliché. Poor little rich girl, right? No, Atlas said fiercely, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. The protective instinct that had driven him to teach her self-defense, to check her homework, to scare away boys who weren't good enough for her, it all came flooding back. You sound like someone who's never been allowed to figure out who she really is. Their eyes met under the streetlight and something electric passed between them. Lyra felt her breath catch at the intensity in his gaze, the way he was looking at her like he could see straight through to her soul. Like he knew her in ways that should have been impossible. Why do I feel like I know you? She whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Atlas went very still. For a moment, the careful mask he'd been wearing slipped, and she could see something raw and painful flash across his features. Recognition, longing, and a grief so deep it made her chest tight with inexplicable emotion. Then he reached out and took her hand, thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm exactly the way he used to when she was scared during thunderstorms. Maybe because you do, he said quietly, his voice thick with 15 years of longing. Maybe we knew each other in another life. The words sent shivers down her spine, not because they were romantic, but because they felt true in a way that made no logical sense. Standing there with the stranger's hand in hers, Lyra felt more at home than she had in years. Atlas was fighting every instinct he possessed not to pull her into his arms, not to tell her everything right there on the sidewalk. She was so close, so trusting, so completely herself despite everything Richard had done to break her spirit. The girl he'd loved was still there, still trying to save the world one person at a time. I don't usually do this, she admitted. Leave events with strangers, I mean. I don't usually go to events like this at all. His smile was self-deprecating, tinged with secrets she couldn't read. But I'm really glad I did tonight. Why? Atlas brought her hand to his lips and pressed the softest kiss to her knuckles. A gesture so tender and familiar it made her heart race with recognition she couldn't name. Because, he said, his voice thick with emotion he was barely containing, meeting you feels like the best thing that's happened to me in 15 years. The specific time frame should have been a clue, but Lyra was too caught up in the moment to notice. All she could focus on was the way the stranger looked at her like she was precious, like she was exactly what he'd been searching for his entire life. She had no idea how right she was. Murphy's Tavern was a world away from the corporate glitter they'd escaped. In the dim lighting and comfortable chaos, Lyra seemed to shed the polished executive persona entirely. She laughed more freely, gestured with her hands when she talked, and Atlas could see glimpses of the spirited girl he remembered beneath the careful conditioning. You know what the worst part is? Lyra said, stealing another one of his fries. I'm 30 years old and I've never made a single major decision without considering what my father would think first. College, career, even the apartment I live in, it's all been about staying within the boundaries of what's expected. Atlas watched her face as she spoke, seeing the frustration that had been building for years. What would you choose if his opinion didn't matter? Everything would be different. She paused, considering. I'd probably be broke and happy instead of rich and empty. Money isn't everything, Atlas said quietly. Says the man who clearly has enough of it to afford custom suits, Lyra teased, but her smile faded when she saw his expression. I'm sorry. That was thoughtless. No, you're right. I do well enough now. But I remember what it was like to have nothing, to depend entirely on other people's generosity. Atlas's voice carried weight she couldn't understand. Sometimes the people who save you end up being the ones who destroy you. Something in his tone made her reach across the table again, her fingers finding his. Is that what happened to your family? The ones who took you in? Atlas stared down at their joined hands, fighting the urge to tell her everything. Something like that. I'm sorry, she said softly. For whatever they did to you. The simple compassion in her voice nearly undid him. She was still the same person, still trying to heal the world's wounds, still seeing the best in people even when they'd been hurt. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing as naturally as it had when she was 15 and would curl up in his room to escape Richard's business dinners. But now there was an undercurrent of attraction, a tension that built with every shared laugh and meaningful glance. When they finally left Murphy's, the city felt different around them, softer, more intimate. They walked slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. I have a confession, Lyra said as they approached the Grand Meridian. I don't usually do this. Any of this. Leave events with strangers, go to dive bars, feel like I've known someone my entire life when I met them 3 hours ago. What's different about tonight? You. She stopped walking and turned to face him. You make me feel like myself. Like the person I was before I learned to be careful about everything. Atlas felt his chest tighten. She was so close to the truth, so close to remembering who she used to be when she was with him. Lyra, he started, but she stepped closer, cutting off whatever he'd been about to say. I know this is crazy, she whispered. But I don't want tonight to end. I don't want to go back to being the person I was this morning. The invitation in her eyes was unmistakable, and Atlas felt his resolve wavering. She was beautiful and willing and looking at him like he was everything she'd been searching for. But she was also Lyra, his Lyra, and she had no idea who he really was. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rough with conflicting emotions. I'm sure. She reached up to touch his face, her thumb tracing his cheekbone. Tomorrow I'll go back to being Richard Sterling's dutiful daughter. But tonight I want to be just Lyra. With you. They rode the elevator to his suite in charged silence, the air between them electric with possibility and unspoken longing. But when the doors closed behind them in his room, Atlas found himself hesitating. Lyra, wait. He caught her hands as she reached for his tie. I need you to understand something. I'm not someone who does casual. Neither am I, she said, studying his face. But maybe that's exactly why this feels so right. You don't know me, Atlas said desperately, even as every instinct screamed at him to stop talking and just hold her. Not really. What if tomorrow changes everything? Lyra was quiet for a moment, her gray eyes searching his face. Are you married? Engaged? In love with someone else? No. God, no. Are you going to hurt me? Physically, I mean. Never, Atlas said fiercely. I would never hurt you. Then what are you so afraid of? How could he explain that he was terrified of taking advantage of her amnesia? That making love to her while she didn't remember their history felt like a betrayal of everything they'd once meant to each other? I'm afraid, he said finally, that you'll regret this. That when you know more about who I am, you'll wish tonight had never happened. Lyra stepped closer, her hands sliding up his chest. Atlas, look at me. When he did, her eyes were steady and sure. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Maybe we'll see each other again, maybe we won't. Maybe this is just one perfect night that we'll both remember fondly. But right now, in this moment, I want to be here with you. Lyra. I'm not asking for promises, she continued, her voice soft but determined. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for tonight. Just tonight. Can you give me that? Atlas stared into her eyes that had looked at him with such trust when she was little, eyes that were looking at him with desire and certainty now, and felt his last defenses crumble. Just tonight, he whispered and kissed her. They moved together with a desperate tenderness, as if they both understood that this moment existed outside of time, separate from whatever complications tomorrow might bring. Atlas tried to memorize everything, the way she sighed his name, the trust in her eyes, the feeling of finally being whole again after 15 years of emptiness. When they made love, it was with an intensity that surprised them both. Every touch felt like recognition, every kiss like coming home. Lyra found herself crying from the overwhelming rightness of it all, while Atlas held her like she was something precious he'd thought he'd lost forever. Why does this feel like more than just tonight? Lyra whispered afterward, curled against his chest. Atlas pressed his lips to her hair, breathing in her familiar scent. I don't know, he lied. But it does. I should go, she murmured, but made no move to leave his arms. Stay, Atlas said, the word torn from somewhere deep in his soul. Please. You said we had tonight. Let me have all of it. She tilted her head up to look at him, seeing something vulnerable and almost desperate in his expression. Okay, she whispered. All of it. As she drifted off to sleep, Atlas lay awake holding her, his mind racing. Tomorrow his lawyers would announce the hostile takeover. Tomorrow she'd discover exactly who he was and what he'd been planning. Tomorrow she'd realize that the man she'd given herself to was her father's greatest enemy. But she'd also said this was just one night, that she wasn't asking for promises or forever. Maybe when the truth came out, she'd remember her own words. Maybe she'd understand that what happened between them tonight was separate from the corporate war that was about to unfold. Or maybe she'd feel betrayed and used and he'd lose her all over again. Atlas tightened his arms around her sleeping form and tried not to think about tomorrow. She'd given him tonight, all of it, and he was going to hold on to every moment until the sun forced them back into a world where they were supposed to be enemies. When Lyra woke to empty sheets and morning sunlight, she found Atlas's note on the pillow. Emergency call from work. Last night was perfect. Thank you for giving me tonight. She smiled, stretching languidly as memories of their incredible evening washed over her. He'd been right to hesitate, right to make sure she understood what she was choosing. But she didn't regret a single moment. For one night, she'd been exactly who she wanted to be. Her phone buzzed with her father's text about the emergency board meeting, and reality came crashing back. Whatever crisis was unfolding at Sterling Corp, she'd have to face it. But she'd face it as someone who'd finally remembered what it felt like to be truly alive. She had no idea that in 2 hours she'd discover that her perfect stranger was the man trying to destroy everything her father had built, and that their one night was about to become the most complicated relationship of her life. The Sterling Corporation boardroom felt different this morning. Lyra noticed it the moment she stepped through the mahogany doors, an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with the usual pre-meeting jitters. Board members who normally exchanged pleasantries sat in rigid silence, their faces grave as they scrolled through tablets and whispered urgent conversations into phones. Margaret Wong looked up as Lyra took her seat, her usually composed expression strained. "Thank God you're here. We've been trying to reach you for the past hour." "My phone was on silent," Lyra said, settling into her chair. "What's the emergency?" Before Margaret could answer, Richard Sterling strode into the room, his silver hair immaculate but his face showing signs of a sleepless night. He moved with the controlled urgency of a man fighting a battle on multiple fronts. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began without preamble, "at 6:30 this morning, Rivera Tech's legal team filed papers announcing their intention to acquire Sterling Corporation through a hostile takeover. They currently control 38% of our stock." The words hit the room like a bomb. Lyra felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her. A hostile takeover meant someone had been systematically buying up Sterling Corp shares, planning this attack for months, maybe years. "Who's behind Rivera Tech?" asked David Kim, the head of operations. "A man named Atlas Rivera," Richard said, and Lyra's world tilted on its axis. Atlas? Her Atlas from last night, who'd held her so tenderly, who'd been reluctant to make love to her because he was afraid she'd regret it. Atlas Rivera, CEO of Rivera Tech, the man trying to destroy her father's company. The room continued around her, but Lyra could barely hear over the roaring in her ears. She gripped the edge of the conference table, fighting waves of nausea as the pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. "The timing isn't coincidental," Richard continued, his voice cutting through her shock. "Rivera has been planning this for months. Our intelligence suggests he's been targeting Sterling Corp specifically, not just as a business opportunity, but as some kind of personal vendetta." Personal vendetta. The words echoed in Lyra's mind as she remembered Atlas's careful questions about her family, his interest in her work, the way he'd seemed to know exactly what to say to make her feel understood. "What do we know about him?" Margaret asked. Richard's expression darkened. "Atlas Rivera founded Rivera Tech 7 years ago with venture capital funding. But here's what's interesting, before that there's almost no record of him. It's like he didn't exist before he started his company." "Sir," David Kim interrupted, "we're getting calls from major shareholders. The stock price has already dropped 12% since the announcement broke." "Handle the shareholders," Richard ordered. "Tell them we're implementing immediate defensive measures. Margaret, I want you to contact our legal team and our investment bankers. We need to explore every option for blocking this takeover." "What about a white knight strategy?" suggested another board member. "Find a friendly buyer to counter Rivera's offer?" "Already in motion," Richard replied. "But our priority right now is understanding exactly what we're dealing with. Rivera Tech isn't just trying to acquire us, they're trying to destroy us. The question is why?" Lyra forced herself to speak, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. Have you had any previous contact with Atlas Rivera? Any business dealings that might explain this personal angle?" Richard's gaze sharpened as it focused on her, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, suspicion, calculation, fear. "Why do you ask? You said it was personal. That suggests some kind of history." "There might be," Richard said carefully. "I'm having our security team investigate Rivera's background more thoroughly. If there's a connection, we'll find it." The meeting continued for another hour, but Lyra absorbed little of it. Her mind was spinning with questions and horrible possibilities. Had Atlas known who she was last night? Had their entire encounter been orchestrated? Was she just another piece in whatever game he was playing against her father? But then she remembered the way he'd looked at her, the genuine reluctance in his voice when he tried to slow things down. The way he'd held her afterward, like she was something precious he was afraid to lose. Either Atlas Rivera was the most skilled manipulator she'd ever encountered, or there was more to this story than her father was telling them. When the meeting finally ended, Lyra remained in her seat as the other board members filed out, their voices carrying urgent discussions about damage control and defensive strategies. Richard approached her, his expression concerned. "Lyra, are you all right? You've been quiet." "Just processing," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "This is a lot to take in." "I know it is. But I want you to know that we're going to fight this. Rivera Tech might think they can waltz in here and steal everything we've built, but they're wrong." "Dad," Lyra said carefully, "when you said this might be personal, what did you mean?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "There are some things in my past, Lyra. Business decisions I made that not everyone agreed with. It's possible that Atlas Rivera is connected to one of those situations." "What kind of situations?" "The kind that sometimes require difficult choices to protect what matters most." Richard's voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. "I've always tried to shield you from the uglier aspects of business, sweetheart. But sometimes, when you're building something important, you have to make enemies." The non-answer felt like a door slamming shut, but Lyra pressed on. "Maybe if you told me more about these past situations I could help. My strategic analysis might." "No." Richard's voice was firm. "This isn't your burden to carry. Rivera Tech is targeting Sterling Corp because of decisions I made, not you. I won't have you dragged into something that's fundamentally about my past." But Lyra was already being dragged into it, whether Richard knew it or not. The man she'd spent the night with, the man who'd made her feel more alive than she had in years, was apparently her father's enemy. And she had no idea which version of Atlas Rivera was real, the tender lover who'd been afraid she'd regret their night together, or the corporate raider systematically destroying her family's empire. "I should get back to work," she said, standing on unsteady legs. "The Yamamoto deal needs—" "Forget the Yamamoto deal," Richard interrupted. "Everything changes now. I need you focused on this Rivera situation. I need your analytical mind helping us understand what we're up against." Lyra nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. She needed to talk to Atlas, needed to understand what was really happening. The man she'd been with last night had been real, she was certain of that. But Atlas Rivera, CEO and corporate raider, was apparently real too. She needed to figure out which one was telling the truth. "Lyra," Richard called as she reached the door. "I want you to be extra careful for the next few weeks. When someone launches this kind of attack, they don't always limit themselves to boardroom warfare. Promise me you'll be cautious." "Cautious of what?" "Of anyone who might try to get close to you to gather information about our defensive strategies. Corporate espionage isn't always conducted in offices. Sometimes it's much more personal." The words hit her hard. Richard couldn't know about last night, could he? But the timing of his warning, the way he was looking at her. "Of course," she managed. "I'll be careful." But as she walked back to her office, Lyra realized that being careful was no longer an option. She was already in the middle of whatever war was brewing between Atlas Rivera and her father. The only question was which side she was really on. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart stopped when she saw the sender, Atlas. "I know you've seen the news by now. Please let me explain. Coffee shop on 5th and Main, 1 hour. I owe you the truth." Lyra stared at the message, her hands shaking. In 1 hour, she'd either discover that the most incredible night of her life had been an elaborate deception, or that her father had been lying to her about something fundamental. She typed back, 1 hour. This better be good. But even as she sent the message, Lyra knew that nothing Atlas could say would make this situation simple. The man she'd spent the night with and the enemy trying to destroy her family were the same person. And somehow she was going to have to choose between them. The coffee shop on 5th and Main was busier than it had been the night before, filled with the lunch crowd and the buzz of normal people living normal lives. She'd spent the hour since Atlas's text researching Rivera Tech, trying to understand the man who'd held her so tenderly while apparently planning to destroy her family's company. What she'd found had only deepened the mystery. Rivera Tech was legitimate, successful, and by all accounts, ethically run. Atlas Rivera was described in business journals as brilliant but reclusive, a visionary who'd built his company from nothing. None of it matched the picture her father had painted of a vindictive corporate raider. When Atlas walked through the door, Lyra felt her breath catch despite everything. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept after leaving her bed, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like grief. When their eyes met across the crowded cafe, she saw him steel himself as if preparing for battle. He slid into the seat across from her, and for a moment they just stared at each other in loaded silence. "You look like you want to kill me," Atlas said finally. "I'm considering it," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Though I'm not sure if it would be for lying to me or for making me fall for you right before you tried to destroy my family." Atlas flinched. "Lyra, I need you to listen to me. Really listen. Because everything you think you know about this situation is wrong. Then explain it. Explain how the man who was afraid I'd regret sleeping with him is the same man who's been planning a hostile takeover of my father's company." "Because I wasn't planning a hostile takeover," Atlas said urgently. "I was planning to approach your father directly, to try to resolve something that should have been settled 15 years ago. But he forced my hand." 15 years ago? Lyra's pulse quickened. "What happened 15 years ago?" Atlas studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition. "How much do you remember about your teenage years, Lyra? Specifically when you were 15? The question sent a chill down her spine. "Why does everyone keep asking me about my memory?" "Everyone?" "My father. Now you. It's like there's some conspiracy to make me think I'm missing something important from my past." Atlas leaned forward, his voice gentle but urgent. "What if you are missing something? What if there are things about your family, about your father, that you don't remember because someone made sure you wouldn't?" "That's impossible. I had some depression when I was 16, some memory issues, but the doctors said..." "What if the doctors were wrong? Or what if they were told what to say?" Lyra stared at him, her mind racing. "You're talking about conspiracy theories? Medical manipulation? That's insane." "Is it?" Atlas pulled out his phone and showed her a document. "This is the original patent filing for the algorithm that made Sterling Corp billions. Look at the date and look at the signature." Lyra took the phone with trembling hands. The document was clearly authentic, filed 6 months before her father claimed to have developed the technology. And the signature at the bottom read, "Atlas Rivera." "This proves nothing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Patents can be forged, documents can be altered. They can be. But this one wasn't." Atlas's voice was quiet, patient. "Lyra, 15 years ago, I wasn't your father's competitor. I was family." "Family?" Something stirred in the depths of her memory, a flash of warmth and safety and belonging that felt achingly familiar. "I don't understand. Your father took me in when I was 20. I lived in your house for 7 years. I was..." Atlas paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was like a big brother to you." Big brother. The words triggered something deep in her mind, a cascade of images and emotions that made her gasp. A young man with dark hair teaching her to play chess. Patient hands helping her with homework. A voice reading bedtime stories, making her laugh, telling her she was smart enough to do anything. "No," she whispered, but the memories were flooding back now, unstoppable and overwhelming. Atlas at 25, letting her help with his coding projects. Atlas making her pancakes shaped like animals on Saturday mornings. Atlas defending her when Richard's business partners dismissed her ideas, telling her that her mind was her greatest asset. "You remember," Atlas said softly, watching the recognition dawn in her eyes. "I remember," she breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh God, Atlas, I remember everything. You lived with us. You were the most important person in my world." "You were mine too," Atlas said, his own voice thick with emotion. "For 7 years taking care of you, watching you grow up, being part of your family, it was everything to me. But you left." The memory was painful, fragmented. "There was a fight. You and Dad were shouting and then you were gone. I didn't leave, Lyra. You threw me out. Had me arrested on false charges, destroyed my reputation, made sure I could never come back." "Why?" The question came out as a sob. "Why would he do that to you? To us?" Atlas reached across the table and took her hands, his touch as gentle as she remembered from childhood. "Because I threatened his control. I developed that algorithm on my own time with my own resources. When I told him I wanted to patent it independently, maybe start my own company someday, he saw it as betrayal. So he stole your work. He stole more than that. He stole my family. My home. My relationship with you." Atlas's voice was steady, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. "But the worst part was what he did to you afterward." "What do you mean?" "You fought for me, Lyra. When he told you I was a thief, you didn't believe him. You demanded proof, threatened to find me yourself. You were 15 years old and absolutely fierce in your loyalty." More memories surfaced, screaming matches with her father, writing letters to Atlas that were never sent, the growing certainty that her father was lying about everything. "The breakdown," she said suddenly. It wasn't random, was it? No. When you wouldn't stop asking questions, when you threatened to leave and find me, Richard had you convinced that your feelings for me were unhealthy. Obsessive. He used doctors, therapists, medication, whatever it took to make you forget. He made me believe my own memories were symptoms of mental illness. The full scope of the manipulation was becoming clear, and it made her sick. He erased 7 years of my life because he couldn't control my loyalty to you. I'm so sorry, Atlas said, squeezing her hands. I should have fought harder to get back to you. Should have found a way to tell you the truth. You tried, didn't you? The takeover, it's not about revenge. It's about getting close enough to tell me what really happened. Atlas nodded. I built Rivera Tech to prove I wasn't the unstable kid he painted me as. I wanted to be successful enough that someday, maybe, I could approach your family again. But when I finally had the resources to try, Richard started attacking my company. Spreading rumors, stealing clients, trying to destroy everything I'd built. So you fought back. I defended myself. The takeover isn't about destroying Sterling Corp, Lyra. It's about removing Richard from power before he destroys more lives. He's done this before, to other young entrepreneurs who threatened his empire. Lyra stared at their joined hands, processing everything she'd learned. The man she'd fallen in love with last night wasn't a stranger at all. He was the person who'd shaped her childhood, who'd taught her to dream big and think for herself. The person her father had systematically erased from her memory. Last night, she said quietly, did you know who I was? From the moment I saw you at the bar. Atlas's voice was honest, vulnerable. I'd been following your career from a distance, making sure you were safe and happy. When I saw you there, I couldn't stay away. But you didn't tell me. How could I? You looked at me like a complete stranger. I realized Richard's conditioning had worked perfectly. You had no memory of me at all. Atlas's voice cracked slightly. I thought maybe it was better that way. Maybe you were happier not remembering the pain of losing me. So you were going to let me go on not knowing? I was going to try. But then you started talking about feeling trapped, about not knowing who you really were, and I realized that forgetting me hadn't made you happy. It had just made you lost. Lyra pulled her hands free and wiped tears from her cheeks. When you hesitated last night, when you said I might regret it, you weren't worried about casual sex. You were worried about taking advantage of my amnesia. I was terrified that I was betraying your trust. That making love to you while you didn't remember our history was wrong, even if you were choosing it freely. But I insisted. You did. And God help me, I wanted you so much that I convinced myself it was okay. That what we had as adults could be separate from what we'd lost as family. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, processing the complexity of their situation. So the man I fell in love with last night? Is the same person who loved you as a child. Just older and hopefully wiser, and completely in love with the woman you've become. And my father? Atlas's expression hardened. Is the man who destroyed both our lives to protect his own interests. Who's been controlling and manipulating you for 15 years to keep you from remembering the truth. Lyra's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Where are you? We need to discuss our response strategy. This Rivera situation is more serious than I initially thought. She showed Atlas the message. He's getting suspicious. Probably. Richard's not stupid. He knows that if I'm making a move against Sterling Corp, I might try to contact you. What do I do? Atlas studied her face, seeing the conflict there. The woman torn between the father who'd raised her and the truth that was finally setting her free. That's your choice, Lyra. I can't make it for you. But I can tell you this, whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you want to stand by Richard, if you think he was protecting you rather than controlling you, I'll withdraw the takeover and disappear from your life again. And if I choose you? Then we finish what he started 15 years ago. We take back what he stole, from both of us. Lyra looked into Atlas's storm-gray eyes, eyes she'd loved as a child, lost as a teenager and found again as a woman, and felt her world reshaping itself around this new reality. I need to go home, she said finally. I need to confront him. I need to hear him try to justify 15 years of lies. Lyra, be careful. Richard's desperate now, and desperate people do dangerous things. I know. But I can't move forward until I understand exactly what I'm moving away from. She stood to leave, then paused. Atlas? Thank you for giving me back my memories. For giving me back myself. Thank you for coming back to me, he replied. Even if you didn't know you were doing it. The Sterling family mansion felt different as Lyra drove through the gates. Smaller somehow, less imposing now that she understood the lies it had been built on. She sat in her car for a moment, gathering courage for what might be the most important conversation of her life. Her phone had been buzzing constantly during the drive home. Missed calls from board members, urgent emails about Rivera Tech's next moves, and 3 more texts from her father asking where she was. But Lyra had ignored them all. This conversation needed to happen away from corporate politics and boardroom strategies. This was about family. About truth. About 15 years of stolen memories. She found Richard in his home office, surrounded by legal documents and financial reports. He looked up when she entered, relief flooding his features. "Thank God you're here. I've been trying to reach you for hours. We need to coordinate our response to Rivera's latest filing." "We need to talk about Atlas," Lyra interrupted, closing the door behind her. Richard's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "What about him? About who he really is? About what really happened 15 years ago?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard set down his pen slowly, his face cycling through several emotions before settling on careful concern. "Lyra, what's brought this on? Has someone been talking to you about?" "I remembered, Dad." The words came out quietly, but they hit the room like a bomb. "I remember everything. Atlas living here. Being part of our family. The algorithm he developed. The fight. All of it." Richard went very still. "Sweetheart, you know your memories from that time aren't reliable." The doctors explained. "The doctors explained what you told them to explain." Lyra moved closer to his desk, her voice gaining strength. "You had me convinced that loving Atlas was a mental illness. That my own memories were symptoms to be medicated away. I was protecting you? From what? From the person who taught me to think for myself? Who believed in my potential when you saw me as just a pretty accessory to your empire?" Richard stood, moving around the desk toward her. "Lyra, you don't understand what Atlas was really like back then. The influence he had over you was unhealthy. Obsessive. You would have thrown your entire future away for him. Maybe that should have been my choice to make. You were 15 years old. And now I'm 30. Lyra's voice rose. "I'm 30 years old, and I just discovered that half my childhood was erased because you couldn't handle the fact that I loved someone more than I feared disappointing you." Richard's face crumpled slightly. It wasn't about jealousy, Lyra. It was about protecting your future. Atlas was using you to get closer to our family secrets, to our business strategies. He was 27 years old and in love with a 15-year-old? Lyra's voice was incredulous. "Dad, do you hear yourself? You're describing a predator, not the man who spent 7 years treating me like a beloved little sister. The feelings weren't mutual then, but they could have become." "Stop." Lyra held up a hand. "Just stop. I've seen the patent documents, Dad. I know Atlas developed that algorithm independently. I know you stole his work and then had him arrested when he tried to claim credit." Richard's shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked every one of his 50 years. The algorithm was developed using Sterling Corp resources. Our computers, our research, our time. His time. His ideas. His breakthrough. Lyra pulled out her phone and showed him the patent filing. "This is dated 6 months before you claim to have developed the technology. Atlas has documentation proving he worked on it independently in his own space with his own equipment." Richard stared at the document, and Lyra saw something she'd never seen before in her father's eyes: defeat. "Even if that's true," he said quietly, "everything else I did was to protect you. To protect our family." "Our family?" Lyra laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dad, Atlas was our family. For 7 years he was the best part of our family. And you destroyed that because you were afraid of losing control." "I was afraid of losing you." Richard's composure finally cracked completely. "Your mother died when you were 8, Lyra. You were all I had left, and I watched you transfer all that love, all that devotion, to someone who could leave us at any moment." The raw pain in his voice made Lyra pause. "So you made sure he would leave?" "I made sure you wouldn't follow him when he did." Richard slumped into his chair. "Maybe I was wrong about the algorithm. Maybe I was wrong about his motives. But I wasn't wrong about the hold he had over you. You would have chosen him over everything, over college, over your future, over me. And that terrified you. It destroyed me." Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "I'd already lost your mother. I couldn't lose you too." For a moment, Lyra felt a flicker of sympathy for the broken man in front of her. But then she remembered 15 years of lies, of medication, of being told her own feelings were pathological. "So you decided to make the choice for me. You erased the person I loved most and convinced me it was healing." "I convinced myself it was healing," Richard corrected. I told myself that if you could forget Atlas, you could move on. Be happy. Build a life that didn't revolve around someone who might leave. But I wasn't happy, was I? I spent 15 years feeling like something was missing, like I was living someone else's life. You didn't protect me, Dad. You broke me. Richard looked up at her, tears in his eyes. I know that now. Watching you these past few years, seeing how lost you've been. I know I made the wrong choice. But I don't know how to fix it. You can start by telling me the truth about Rivera Tech. About why you've been attacking Atlas's company. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Because I was afraid. When Rivera Tech started becoming successful, when Atlas started making a name for himself in our industry, I was terrified that he'd come back for you. That he'd tell you the truth and you'd hate me for what I'd done. So you tried to destroy him first. I tried to protect what we'd built together. The company, our relationship, the life you'd made without him. The life you forced me to make, Lyra corrected. Dad, I need you to understand something. The takeover, Atlas's actions against Sterling Corp, none of that is about revenge. It's about survival. You've been systematically trying to destroy his business for months. And now he's trying to destroy ours. No. He's trying to remove you from power before you can hurt anyone else the way you hurt him. The way you hurt me. Richard stared at her for a long moment. What are you saying, Lyra? I'm saying that I understand why you were afraid. I understand that losing Mom made you desperate to hold on to me. But understanding doesn't excuse 15 years of lies and manipulation. So what happens now? Lyra took a deep breath. Now you have a choice. You can keep fighting this war you started, keep trying to destroy the man I love and lose me forever. Or you can step down, let the board decide Sterling Corp's future, and maybe, we can find a way to rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty instead of control. The man you love? Richard's voice was hollow. You're in love with him? I fell in love with him twice, Dad. Once when I was 15 and he was the most important person in my world. And again last night, when I met him as a stranger and felt like I was coming home. Richard closed his eyes. Last night? I was at the Innovation Summit. We met at the bar, spent the evening together. I had no idea who he was, but something about him felt, right? Familiar. Like I'd been waiting my whole life to find him again. And now I know why. He wasn't a stranger, Dad. He was the person you taught me to forget. Richard sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything she'd told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was resigned. What do you want me to do? I want you to call an emergency board meeting. I want you to announce your resignation as CEO and recommend that the board consider Rivera Tech's offer seriously. I want you to stop fighting a war that's already over. And if I do that, what happens to us? Lyra looked at the man who'd raised her, loved her, and ultimately betrayed her in the name of protection. I don't know, Dad. Trust has to be rebuilt and that takes time. But if you're willing to try, if you're willing to be honest with me from now on, then maybe we can find our way back to each other. Richard nodded slowly. I'll make the calls tonight. The board can meet tomorrow morning. Thank you. Lyra? Richard called as she reached the door. For what it's worth, I am proud of the woman you've become. Even if I can't take credit for the best parts of who you are. The best parts of who I am came from both of you, Lyra said softly. From you and from Atlas. I just wish you'd trusted me enough to let me keep both. As she walked out of her childhood home, Lyra felt like she was finally walking toward her real life. The one she'd been meant to live before fear and control had derailed everything. Her phone buzzed with a text from Atlas. How did it go? She typed back, it's over. He's stepping down. We won. We. Lyra smiled as she got into her car. We. I choose us, Atlas. I choose the truth. I choose the life we should have had 15 years ago. The response came immediately, come home. And for the first time in 15 years, Lyra knew exactly where home was. Rivera Tech's headquarters was quieter at 8 in the evening, most employees having gone home to their families. But Atlas's office was still brightly lit, and Lyra could see him through the glass walls as the elevator opened, pacing behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, managing what was probably the most complex business negotiation of his career. When he saw her, his entire demeanor changed. He ended his call mid-sentence and crossed the office in quick strides, pulling her into his arms the moment she stepped through the door. How are you? He asked, studying her face for signs of damage from her confrontation with Richard. Exhausted. Relieved. Angry. Hopeful. Lyra leaned into his embrace, breathing in his familiar scent. It's been a complicated day. Tell me what happened. They settled onto the couch in his office and Lyra recounted her conversation with Richard. His breakdown, his admissions, his agreement to step down. Atlas listened without interrupting, his arm around her shoulders, occasionally pressing kisses to her temple. He's calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, she finished. He'll recommend that they seriously consider your acquisition offer. And how do you feel about that? Lyra was quiet for a moment, processing the question. Strange. Sterling Corp has been my whole life for so long. The idea of it changing, of not being Richard Sterling's daughter first and Lyra second. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. You know you don't have to choose between your career and me, right? Atlas said gently. Whatever happens with the companies, I want you to do what makes you happy. What makes me happy, Lyra said, turning to face him, is the idea of building something new. Something that's ours, not his. Something based on truth instead of stolen foundations. Atlas smiled. I like the sound of that. What did you have in mind? Well, Rivera Tech could use someone with acquisition experience. And I have some ideas about documentary filmmaking that might translate well to corporate storytelling. She paused, suddenly uncertain. Unless you think mixing business with personal is a bad idea. Lyra, we've been mixing business with personal since the day I moved into your house when you were 8 years old. I think we can handle it. She laughed, and the sound was lighter than anything Atlas had heard from her in years. When you put it that way? Besides, Atlas continued, I've been thinking about expanding Rivera Tech's focus. We've been successful with software development, but there's a whole world of ethical business practices we could be pioneering. Companies that prioritize truth over profit, innovation over manipulation. A direct challenge to everything my father built his empire on. A direct challenge to the way business has always been done. But with your strategic mind and my technical background. Atlas trailed off, letting the possibility hang between them. We could change everything, Lyra finished softly. We could try. They were interrupted by a knock on the glass door. Atlas's assistant, Sarah, stood outside with an apologetic expression and a stack of urgent-looking documents. I'm sorry to interrupt, Sarah said as Atlas waved her in, but the Sterling Corp board has requested an emergency conference call. They want to discuss terms tonight instead of waiting for tomorrow's meeting. Atlas and Lyra exchanged glances. Richard works fast when he's motivated, Lyra observed. Are you ready for this? Atlas asked her. Are you? I've been ready for 15 years. The conference call lasted 3 hours. Board members who'd known Lyra since childhood listened in stunned silence as she explained her recovered memories, her father's manipulation, and her decision to support the Rivera Tech acquisition. Margaret Wong asked pointed questions about the transition of power, while David Kim focused on employee protection and company culture. But it was Lyra's presence on the call, her clear support for Atlas's vision, that ultimately swayed the board. When the vote was called, it was unanimous. Sterling Corp would accept Rivera Tech's acquisition offer, with Richard Sterling stepping down immediately and Atlas Rivera taking over as CEO of the newly merged company. There's one more thing, Lyra said as the call was winding down. I'd like to propose a name change for the merged company. Sterling Rivera Technologies doesn't feel right anymore. Too much history, too much baggage. What do you suggest? Asked Margaret. Lyra looked at Atlas, who nodded encouragingly. Meridian Technologies. A meridian is a line that connects different points on a map, bringing them together into a unified whole. It seems appropriate for what we're trying to build. The board approved the name change without discussion. After the call ended, Atlas and Lyra sat in his office in comfortable silence, processing what had just happened. In the span of 24 hours, they'd gone from strangers to lovers to business partners to something that didn't have a name yet but felt like everything they'd both been searching for. So, Atlas said finally, we're really doing this. We're really doing this. Lyra curled up against his side. Meridian Technologies, COSIOS, changing the world one ethical business practice at a time. COSIOS. You didn't think I was going to let you have all the fun, did you? Lyra grinned up at him. Besides, someone needs to keep you from being too nice to our competitors. Atlas laughed. I love you, he said, the words coming easily now that there were no more secrets between them. I love you too, Lyra replied. Both versions of you. The big brother who taught me to dream big, and the man who helped me remember who I really am. They're the same person, you know. I never stopped being the guy who wanted to protect you and help you succeed. I just got better at hiding it. Well, you don't have to hide anymore. 6 months later, Meridian Technologies announced its first major breakthrough. An AI system designed to detect and prevent corporate fraud before it could damage employees or shareholders. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the two people whose love story had been nearly destroyed by exactly that kind of deception. Richard Sterlin had quietly retired to his estate in Napa, where he was reportedly writing his memoirs and learning to tend a vineyard. He and Lyra spoke once a month, careful, polite conversations that were slowly rebuilding trust. It would take time, maybe years, but they were both committed to finding their way back to some version of family. Atlas stood in his new office, their new office, watching Lyra present their latest innovation to a room full of investors. She was brilliant and confident and completely herself, the woman she'd always been meant to be before fear and control had tried to reshape her. "Proud of your wife?" Sarah asked, appearing at his elbow with coffee and a knowing smile. Atlas looked down at the simple gold band on his finger, still amazed that Lyra had said yes when he proposed 3 months ago. They'd been married in a small ceremony overlooking the Pacific, with only close friends and a carefully selected few family members in attendance. "Every day," he said. "Every single day." Some stories, Atlas thought as he watched the woman he loved command the room with her intelligence and passion, were worth waiting for. Some love was worth fighting for. And sometimes, the best revenge against those who tried to tear you apart was simply living well, and loving completely, despite everything they'd done to stop you. The little girl who'd once been his shadow had grown into a woman who stood beside him as an equal partner. And together, they were building something beautiful from the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.